question is about the gay marriage. I would like to know what is the situation regarding the gay marriage today in England, first of all?
The same as France, simultaneously across vast tracts of the Western world. Governments have decided to introduce gay marriage. Notice it hasn't happened in the Arab states.
Surprisingly.
It's funny, isn't it? Because, we're talking about Russia in England at the moment, and the fact that homosexuality is still frowned upon by the Russian government and by a majority of the Russian people. And so there were demonstrations in London with famous actors taking place to say, isn't Russia awful? But no one says anything about Saudi Arabia, or anyone else like that. So there's a bit of hypocrisy in this. Clearly, big Western governments have agreed that they believe this is the right and a civilized thing to do. And it's seen by people who are pushing it to be a logical extension of the reforms that we've had in terms of attitudes towards homosexuality that go back, I don't know about France, but in England, all forms of homosexuality were illegal, imprisonable,
yes,
until the late 1960s. So people think, we want to have a fairer, less judgmental society, and the state shouldn't intervene in people's bedrooms. And actually, I go along with that to a very large extent. But the potential difficulty, I think, that is going to arise from gay marriage is this: that you have a piece of legislation that allows the word marriage to be used between two people of the same sex. And given that ultimately the highest court in all of our lands is the European Court of Justice in Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, in the end, you face a difficulty, which is this: that tolerance of different people's views and ways of life need to be a two-way street. And at the moment, the direction of travel is all in favour of people who are gay and increasingly against people who are Christian, who are Jewish, who are even Muslim, although we dare not talk about it, but and so I see a situation in the United Kingdom where within 2 or 3 years, there'll be a piece of legislation challenged in the court in Strasbourg that says it is discriminatory for the British state to allow the word marriage to be used in a registry office, but not to be used by the Church of England. And so I think that whilst we do want to be tolerant to all sorts of people, we risk having gay marriage imposed upon people of faith, which is anathema to their religion. And it's on those grounds above all, that I've opposed the introduction of gay marriage. I think there's a huge risk for the religious community that they'll be forced into doing something that is against their principles. Now, the difficulty we've got is that this legislation has now gone through, and reversing social legislation is very, very difficult. So I'm now looking and thinking about this in a different way. I haven't yet reached a conclusion, but I will. But something must be done within each country to give all the different faith and religious groups protection against being forced to conduct gay marriages. All right? And that's where I want to go with this. And I think if we can get that legal compromise in place, it'll need us all changing our relationships with the Strasbourg and Luxembourg courts. But if we do that, then I think the risk of this being imposed upon people who are against it will be removed. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the direction that I'm trying to take this in.
Very interesting. Have you had huge demonstrations like we had in France?
No, we're English.
So you
we're English. We're relaxed.
So you didn't have demonstrations?
No, we play cricket. No, I mean, the English are very, very slow to anger. It's a very... But the demonstrations in Paris obviously received very significant media coverage in the United Kingdom, because because hundreds of thousands of people took part in them. But no, in the United Kingdom, whilst there is a large element of disquiet And particularly, the more you go into rural and countryside England, the greater that disquiet is. Because the more traditional families, communities, and where the church is still stronger, although, the Anglican Church is a lot weaker than the Catholic Church. Again, the Anglican Church is a very English form of religion, in that it's very understated. So the level of objection in the United Kingdom has been considerably less than it's been in France.
Okay. Do you have any idea why this change came? Do you think it's just suddenly the European countries decided to change the law?
It's the equality rights agenda. There is driven through this very building where we're talking today, there is a huge drive for what is seen as equality rights, but there is also a very big drive towards secularism. The European Union is a fiercely secular organisation. It is deeply tolerant of Islam, but incredibly hostile to Christianity. And I mean that.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. Nearly 10 years ago, when it came to the putting up of commissioners by each member state country, the Italians put up a conservative called Mr. Buttiglione, who was interviewed by a couple of newspapers. And what Mr. Buttiglione said was that he, as a practicing Catholic, didn't particularly favour homosexuality. But his biggest sin, and this is very serious, he said that he thought it was generally better if it was financially possible that the mother should stay at home until the child reached school age. And this here is considered to be dreadful. And he didn't get the job. He didn't get the job as a European Commissioner for expressing those views. And that was the first time I'd realised here how viciously secular, how determinedly anti-family these institutions are. And, I'm not a social scientist, but all the evidence is that, and actually these days, it could be the man bringing up the child, but certainly in the early life of a baby, all the scientific and medical evidence is clear that if it's possible for a mother to bring up her own baby, it produces more stable and better adjusted adults. And it's just as simple as that. But you see, people talk about the European Union. We generally talk about it in political terms, and we talk about sovereignty, we talk about the lack of democracy, but there's something deeper.
Yes.
There is something deeper that is going on in terms of a willful intent to destroy society. And that makes it very, very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nigel. Very clear. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'm going to add something to what you just said, because it was not, I didn't think about it before, but I think I agree with you, and I think it's not easy if they're doing that kind of laws, because if you take a child away from the family very young, then it's easier to brainwash him. First, they've been telling it a long time.
Yeah, the Jesuits used to do this. Yes.
No, I mean, it seems obvious, and also, no, I don't remember what I was going to say. Yeah, and also the gay marriage. Do you think it's only the gay marriage, and all the countries in the world suddenly decide it was a very important issue? Or do you think there was something deeper behind, like if you put it in perspective with genetic manipulation and the gestation for others, who's going to stop the people who are going to want to buy wombs and put embryos that have a little mind and big muscles to make it?
Well, yes, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Brave New World about all this back in the 1920s. I mean, clearly, in a couple of weeks' time, we've got the G20, 20 of the world's biggest economies, who will go and talk primarily about economics. But obviously, when leaders of big countries get together, they talk about a whole range of issues. So there is a degree of groupthink that appears to go on across the Western world with this. But I don't think that I don't think that the agreement across the West to push for gay marriage, led by the EU more than anybody, I don't think that leads into thoughts on genetics or thoughts on experimental science of any kind. It doesn't go that far. However, when it comes to the ability to decide morally what is the right thing or the wrong thing to do, and we talk about stem cell research, we talk about embryo research, and areas like this. I don't think the G20 will decide those things, but the European Union will. That's the point. So, whoever you vote for to be your government in France will increasingly have. I mean, the current government you've got isn't particularly good in my view, but this is the point, isn't it? That voters who may wish to express an opinion on issues like this increasingly find that they can't really express that opinion, because the big decisions are not being taken at nation-state level.
Right.
The big decisions or the big drive isn't made by people that you can vote for and therefore remove. In Brussels, after all, 75% of all the laws that are made in our countries every year are made by these institutions. And whilst there is a European Parliament, it's only a step stage in the overall process, and this is not where the original thinking comes from. All the legislation that affects everything, from embryo research to what ladders to use to change light bulbs and clean windows, all of that originates at the European Commission. And this is the thing that I don't think the voters of Europe really understand. And it's this, that we've made the European Commission, which is the civil service, the bureaucracy, unelected, mostly unnamed, who have 3,000 committees, secret committees of so-called experts. That is the sole place where legislation derives. And so if you think about it, we've completely turned any principle of what democracy ought to mean and ought to stand for on its head. And that is why increasingly the voters feel really quite impotent, because they feel that really whoever goes into the Elysee or whoever goes into Downing Street or whoever sits in the Assemblée or the House of Commons, increasingly this doesn't really matter anymore. And so you've got a whole young generation out there, under 30s, who increasingly don't vote for anybody, who are absolutely disconnected and can't see the point of voting. And in a way, if you think about it, they're not wrong, are they?
No, I think
they're not wrong.
Right.
And that's why you're beginning to see the growth across Europe of alternative politics, of different political parties. And that's a good thing. But the danger is that the opposition to the establishment and the establishment who are failing on virtually everything. Just look at what the euro is doing to the Mediterranean countries.
Yeah.
Average 50% youth unemployment rates, despair. And the worry is that the opposition to the project that emerges may not be what we would classically call liberal democracy, but you may well find in some parts of Europe, if we had this conversation in 5 or 10 years' time, that actually the reaction to this may be almost as extreme as this place is, and we may well find that the ping-pong ball, after 2 world wars and lots of misery, actually goes back, and we start to get nationalism and extremism, and that, I think, is one of the biggest dangers of this. So I'm one of those people who has really crusaded against forced political union in Europe. I've done it for many years, and probably, arguably, I've had a higher profile than anybody in the European Union by merit of my place in this Parliament and my seat next to Mr. Broso. It's marvellous, isn't it? You couldn't invent it, really. So I've been in that position that I've tried to help, encourage, perhaps on a good day even inspire people to think that we have to do things differently. And I'm optimistic that this union will end, because none of us want it. I'm optimistic that it'll end, but I'm not yet optimistic that what replaces it is going to be the right solution. And that, I think, is where we are with European politics. I wish I could be more optimistic. I think Britain's chances are better than France's, actually.
Really?
I do, and I'll tell you why. I think the British get lots of things wrong through history, lots of little things. But we get almost every little thing wrong, but we're very good at getting the big things right. And I really mean that. And I think the very big thing we got right was saying no to the euro.
Right.
It was an absolutely fundamental decision. The entire establishment had decided Britain would join the euro, and yet, there was to begin with an intellectual fight back, but increasingly that became a business fight back. And so, because we're not in the euro, I think our freedom of movement is very much greater than for countries that are inside the eurozone. And to get the electorates of countries that are inside the eurozone to summon up the courage that is necessary to overturn the status quo is going to be a longer-term project. I don't want to pour water on the hopes of people in Finland and France and the Netherlands and Germany who want their countries to leave the euro. I think they're absolutely right to make those arguments and to run those campaigns, but it is going to be a long, hard fight.
Well, I think people are scared because they keep telling us on television that if you leave euro, something terrible is going to happen to you.
Absolutely.
So most of the people, they don't think by themselves. They just listen to what they say on TV.
Oh, I mean, 600 years ago, if you lived in Spain or Portugal, you were told if you sailed over the horizon, you'd fall off the edge of the world.
Right.
Well, it's true. I mean, the whole point about consensus is that when you have consensus of thinking, whether it's in science or politics or business, that consensus will always automatically mock and deride any challenge that comes to it. And if mockery and derision doesn't work, then it becomes a sort of much more unpleasant and really rather violent dialogue. So yeah, you're right. I mean, when the Irish had a vote on the Lisbon Treaty, and they voted no, but were asked to vote again, they were told the sky will fall in. All economic activity will cease. You'll be living in caves. And I mean,
yeah.
and these are the techniques that are used. But there is one big difference between mass thought and mass opinion in countries now to anything that's ever existed in the past, and it's called the internet.
Right.
And it changes
Everything.
Absolutely everything. I mean, it really does.
Oh yeah.
I mean, would the Battle of the Somme in 1916 have lasted 142 days if the British people had known the truth about what was happening? I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think so. But when your only source of information was the Times of London,
right,
telling you how wonderfully everything was going. So the internet has the power to change things fundamentally. And again, we fall back on this younger generation, in a sense, because they're the key to all of this.
Yeah.
This mass of under 30s who currently aren't voting, aren't engaged, a lot of them very disaffected because of youth unemployment and social problems and all the things that have gone wrong. But it is through the internet that the power for real,
and
genuine
also
change
they see the images. Like nobody would see what's happening in the European Parliament if there was no internet. They can see the faces. They can see how the people.
I mean, I was elected here. Well, I've been elected 3 times to come here, and the last time was 2009, when, as leader of UKIP, we were the second biggest party in Britain. Second biggest party in Britain, here represented in the European Parliament, and yet the BBC, who are a state broadcaster, and we all have to pay £145 a year. Mandatory. We have to pay that. If we don't pay it, we go to prison. And our state broadcaster would hardly ever show you anything I've ever said in this Parliament. I mean, literally, probably twice in 10 years, will the 10 o'clock news in the UK have even the merest clip or mention the fact that UKIP and I exist and are in this place. And I used to get very depressed about that. But now, so what? Doesn't matter. Because with YouTube and all these other means of getting the message out. So I think, I think the ability of big failing organisations to make the public believe that they will fall off the edge of the world is diminishing with every year.
So now they can see the difference between the what they hear on television and what they see on the images.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they get really mad at the European Parliament, because we are like handcuffs in our own country, and when you see the people that decide for us, it's just ridiculous.
Yes, and what a mediocre, humourless bunch they are as well. I mean, they have no redeeming features.
Well, we see things that I wanted to ask you about. We saw that we just learned through Snowden that we've been spied by the secret services. Yeah. Nobody reacted that much in the European Parliament. We just learned through the declassified documents from the American army that they spray us with chemical, and they've been doing it for years. And we can find, I found the documents that prove treaty between America and Canada, for example. A lot of patents that show that they've been using it. Declassified document that show they've been spraying over England to the European, the American and the English army together. Nobody talks about it every time. So, maybe two people try to talk about it in the European Parliament. It doesn't interest anybody.
No, I'm more sceptical about the spraying thing. I don't know. But what I'm not sceptical about is what Snowden has been talking about. Prison, basically. And it's quite interesting, actually, because initially, the British newspapers were pretty shocked by what Snowden had said and the extent to which the Americans were able to monitor what we do and phone calls and internet and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, after a couple of weeks had gone by, I think we concluded that the British government's worse. And it's very easy to knock America, but actually we should look a bit closer to home. The British are the most surveilled people in the Western world. There are CCTV images, absolutely everything we do is monitored. We ourselves have a massive intelligence centre, GCHQ, based in Cheltenham. And of course, with the direction we're going in here, the European Union, of course, can access any of the intelligence information that any individual government has got stored. And is it dangerous? Well, all the while you've got good governments. They might be incompetent, but all the while you've got good government run by people who generally want to make your life better. They might fail, but if they generally want to make your life better, there's not a problem. But the difficulty is, once a bad government is in place and has all this information, then, Big Brother is a very short step away. So I hate all this stuff. And I launch my own little protests against it. I've refused to buy an Oyster card on the London Underground, because if you have an Oyster card, every time you get on an underground train, they can track where you're going. And I won't have a Tesco's supermarket card, because that will tell everybody how many cigarettes I buy and how much gin I drink and maybe many other things I don't know. So I do launch my own little protests against it. But I think if we're really honest about it, we've reached a level where government now has so much information already on us. It's very difficult to see how we can reverse it. I'm a great one for fighting against things if I think we can change things. But I think to row back against the tide of information that has already swept in that direction is going to be well nigh impossible.
But it's not only that. I did a lot of inquiry about health, and globalization has been not only ruining the people, and the nations, but they're also putting our health in big danger with health politics, with the laboratories, with the vaccination.
I must say some of this stuff does shock me. I must say. I mean, two little personal examples. I mean, one, I had a relation that died last year, and she wasn't very old, and it turned out that she'd been on antidepressants for 41 years. Her husband didn't know, but she'd had a baby and suffered a bit of postnatal depression, very common that women do, and so the doctor, and she'd been on them for 41 years. And I used to think that one of the biggest threats to our society was illegal drugs. Now I think it's legal drugs. So I have a lot of sympathy with this.
They take the antidepressant, and they when the patent is over, they take the same molecule, and they do things for your hair to grow, for your stomach pain, for anything. A lot of people are under antidepressant.
It's very worrying. And today, here in Brussels, there's a little demonstration, a very small demonstration going on, led by some British MEPs, but some others I think will join. And this is about e-cigarettes. Right now, nobody can argue smoking's good for you, right? Mm-hmm. That argument doesn't exist. You can argue that it's a free choice, and that people should be free to do it, provided it doesn't upset other people. But we've had this development over the last few years of e-cigarettes, and they're amazing because they have no tar, no carcinogens, they're not heated, and they produce a water vapour that contains some nicotine in it, just like a cup of coffee, has some caffeine in it. So actually, in terms of smoking reduction or smoking cessation, if we think that's an achievable, if we think that's a desirable goal, this is the best thing that's ever happened. This is the best thing that's ever happened. It is the nearest substitute any smoker has got to smoking, and it's very successful. Now, because of your friends, the pharmaceutical lobby, who of course have been making a fortune out of selling anti-smoking drugs that don't work. And because of that, we're now going to get the European Commission, who are going to redefine e-cigarettes as medicines, put them through a huge, elaborate, expensive procedure, and demand that any taste is taken out of these things. So, I've been here 15 years, and I can tell you, as somebody that has worked as part of, a small cog in the European lawmaking process, that the biggest lobby in Brussels is the pharmaceutical industry. And I think its size is I share with you, very disturbing.
Yeah, but why don't the people move? Because everybody knows now, if you start inquiring a little, that they don't produce a medicine to cure disease. They produce disease to sell their medicine.
Well, most people don't inquire. Your question was if people inquire a little. Most people don't. But
the people in the street. I guess the people in the street, they can't do it. But the people in Brussels, they should do it.
But you're missing the point But you're missing the point a bit about what politics has become and what modern governments become. This building is full of people who are paid not to think. Mm-hmm. They're paid to be here, do what they're told, not to think, not to challenge, not to question, because that's too inconvenient.
But
actually, out there, for most people now living in Europe, life is pretty tough. They haven't got that much money. The electricity bill and gas bill have gone through the roof. And people are too busy just living and existing to question things like this. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't question things. It doesn't mean we shouldn't campaign on things. But we have to understand that. Don't look. If for salvation, don't look inside these buildings, because you really won't find many people who are interested.
Yeah, but these people are supposed to protect us. That's why they're here. And globalization mainly destroy everything.
Depends what we mean. It depends what we mean by globalization. Depends what we mean. You see, I think there is another way of looking at globalization, which is this: if countries trade together and do business together, they are more likely to be friends with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, if what globalization means, if what it means is a breaking down of barriers and a deeper understanding between the East and the West and elsewhere, and we do buy and sell things from each other, then probably, in terms of global peace and everything else, that's a good thing, because there is some evidence that suggests that increases in trade do lead to a mutual benefit on both sides and increasing wealth. And if much of the third world becomes wealthier, then it is much more likely that bad regimes will fall.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's and I will accept, slightly idealized view of what globalization could mean. I think the difficulty you've got with globalization is that what it's led to is the domination of the world by less than a handful of companies, and that is the problem, and that is a very real problem. And again, you see, it's hand in glove with big government, isn't it? I mean, you will find, not just the pharma industry, but you will find the biggest supporters of the European lawmaking process are the giant multinationals.
Right.
They love legislation. The more legislation, the better, because they've got legal departments, they've got all the means of compliance, and it is a fantastic way, effectively, of pushing out of business small and medium-sized competitors. So this is, and this is, in a sense, this is what globalization has come to mean to people, and I strongly take the view that it doesn't have to be like that.
Are you hopeful? Do you think there's a way to reverse the situation?
Well, I think, in 100 years' time, when children read history books at school, they will read with astonishment and wonder at how all these disparate, different, individual European nations, with their completely individualistic languages, idiosyncrasies, allowed themselves to be corralled into one state with one flag, one anthem, and Herman Van Rompuy as president. And kids will say, how could we have been so bloody stupid? So I'm optimistic that this microcosm here in Europe of what some see, even more optimistically, as perhaps bringing world government. Mr. Van Rompuy is very keen on global government. So this is, in fact, as I say, the EU's their test bed, if you like. I'm entirely optimistic that will fail, because none of us want it. None of us have ever voted for it, and it doesn't actually work. The economics don't work, the politics don't work. So I'm entirely optimistic that the thing that I've fought against for as long as I have will fall and disappear. And I'd love to be able to look you in the eye and tell you that what follows it will be a return to liberal nation-state democracy, where we have a Europe that trades with each other and is friendly with each other, and where any thought or risk of war was eliminated because there wasn't extreme nationalism without democracy. But I'm less certain of the second bit.
So you're optimistic.
Listen, I'm a screaming
if you
optimist.
Think about, if you're talking about kids in 100 years, that means you're optimistic, because I share what you're saying, but I'm not sure our kids are going to be in good health in 100 years.
Well, you may be right, but all through the history of mankind, they faced various challenges and various evils, and in the end, good wins.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Nigel. Thank you very much.
Good.